Sam Harris, you write in your book, science can, in principle, help us understand what we should do and should want, and therefore what other people should do and should want in order to live the best lives possible.
Yeah. Well, I think this gap between is and ought, or between facts and values, is imaginary. I think it's a myth, and we need not take it seriously. I think the only thing we have to understand is that morality relates to conscious minds. I mean, without a universe of sentient creatures, there's no such thing as right and wrong and good and evil. There's no value there. And the moment you have creatures that can experience changes in the universe, well, then these changes can matter. And I think it's clear that because consciousness is arising out of the way the universe is at some level, it's clearly dependent upon the laws of nature. Then it's clear that there's going to be a science of right and wrong and good and evil. There are possibilities for extraordinary suffering in this world, to speak specifically of human beings, and there are possibilities for extraordinary happiness, and all of the variables that can affect our states of being in this world fall potentially into the various bins of science, from genetics to neurobiology to psychology to sociology to economics. And this is the truths here are not infinitely elastic. We can't just make them up. We have to discover the rudiments of that allow people to trust one another in a thriving civil society, and the causes for those very obvious failures.
And I still wait to see how a new scientific discovery about suffering and flourishing is actually going to settle moral issues which divide us, like, for example, the extent of the freedoms we enjoy, or the way we ought to treat civilian combatants in war, or many, many other moral problems which divide people very deeply.
Right. I'd love to respond to that, Ira.
Go ahead, Sam.
I think, well, first of all, there is an amazing diversity of opinion of just how we should cash out our talk of right and wrong and good and evil, and it's quite remarkable how difficult it can be to get people to concede that human flourishing and the flourishing of conscious creatures generally is what should concern us. But the moment you admit that much, the moment that you admit that a real conversation about morality relates to human well-being, to take our case specifically, then most of moral talk that defines our public policy immediately begins to fall by the wayside. I mean, the Catholic Church is more concerned about preventing contraception than about preventing the rape of children. It's more concerned about preventing gay marriage than genocide. Now, this isn't. If you're concerned about human flourishing, this is clearly an inversion of priorities, to put it most charitably. And so that the framework being offered here is not an alternate moral framework we have to take seriously. This is a framework we can ignore in the same way we could ignore the Catholic Church if they were talking about physics and saying things like, well, we're interested in the physics of the transubstantiation, or the physics that allows the Holy Ghost to be here and there and everywhere at once. There's not a physicist alive who would be forced to take those utterances seriously. And yet, when we talk about morality, it seems that everyone's opinion has to count equally, but everyone's opinion is not actually constrained at this moment by an intelligent or even intelligible concern for human flourishing. And I think the moment we grant that human flourishing is the point, our moral discourse would change remarkably.
Alternative moralities that put a value on, say, harmony of nature, preservation of the species, glorification of the nation, following God's commandments. I mean, when Winston Churchill said nothing is worse than war, dishonor is worse than war, by which he meant national dishonor. The fact that World War I was fought over people believing it was worthwhile to sacrifice their lives for the preeminence of their nation. Those are values that do prick people to action that aren't about flourishing. I would argue that they're not defensible, but at least it is conceivable that their morality is not based on flourishing and suffering.
Right. Well, I think the point there is that it's possible to not know what you're missing. It's possible to be wrong. It's possible to be seeking a better life and to fail to find it. I think we should not be eager to define well-being too narrowly, because I think everything that really every legitimate concern that people have, like fairness and justice and having a clear conscience and even honor to whatever degree it's a requisite of human well-being, a truly open-ended and searching discussion about well-being can absorb these things. And well-being is clearly the point, not merely human well-being, but any creature that can possibly experience it to the degree that it can experience it. So we're more concerned about our fellow primates than we are about insects because we think there's much more to being a primate, and I think we're right to think that based on everything we know about neurology at this moment.
Let me take an example from your book. You say in your book that making women wear burqas or even veils doesn't lead to their well-being. Well, let's say that's the case, but how do you call that opinion scientific? How have we not measured it? It sounds like a value judgment.
Right. Well, again,
we could measure it.
But we could measure it. We could scan the brains of everyone involved, but there's no reason to do that. We know. I mean, Ira, think of what it takes to doubt that we can know this from the point of view of science. It's as though you're saying we have 150 years of neuroscience and sociology and psychology behind us. We've made very impressive gains in our treatment of women. But just maybe forcing half the population to live in cloth bags and beating them or killing them when they try to get out is as good as anything we've come up with. It's just not a position that can be honestly adopted. And we know enough about human well-being at this moment to know that this is not a good practice, and good as defined by all of the correlates of human happiness.
Well, but the whole point of science
Sam, we don't
is
have to.
Wait, well, let me just jump in for a second. But the whole point of science is to create an experiment to prove what you think is true.
Well, no, that's actually
right.
not the.
I mean, isn't it
Stephen's point about secular reason being a larger footprint is very important to take on board, because science is where reason generally is where we are committed to relying on honest observation and clear reasoning. It's not that every single question is experimentally tractable in next month. And there are many scientific truths, an infinite number of scientific truths that we will never be able to test because we can't get the data in hand. You know, how many birds are in flight over the surface of the Earth at this moment? We have no idea, and it just changed. And yet that's a very simple question about the nature of reality, which we know has an answer. We know that questions of human flourishing, whether we can actually get people in the lab and scan their brains, have answers, and some of the answers are so obvious that we need not debate them. And in Afghanistan, throwing battery acid in the face of a little girl for the crime of learning to read is clearly not a mode of sanely pursuing human well-being.
Sam, I don't think you have to scan brains. I mean, I think I agree with you. Obviously, there are many things we won't know about the universe simply because we can't do the testing. But there are lots of things we could test, and I would argue the only way we can determine ultimately whether something is reasonable is by attempting to test it. For example, with burqas, I don't know whether you have to scan the brains, but you could do studies to see whether women are in fact safer, less subject to sexual violence and intimidation. You could do psychological studies of their self-worth, whether they're better performing in tests as a result of. You could imagine doing sociological and psychological testing to actually verify the presumption, which I agree with you on the face of it seems quite reasonable that burqas are not good. But you could certainly do those experiments, and if you did them, you would be better informed and you would make more rational moral decisions based on them.
Right, but certain questions are so easy you need not get a grant from the NSF to seek the data, and I think the burqa is one of them.
Simon?
Well, exactly. You don't need a grant from the NSF. And may I say something about the idea, which seems to be in the background, that a neurophysiological measure would be, in some sense, the gold standard measure of well-being.
I actually didn't mean to suggest that, but I'm just saying that is one mode.
It came out as a suggestion. Right. And there's a well-known philosophical objection to that, which is that you can compare two people, each of whom believes themselves to be flourishing in the same way. They're each, living the American life. They've got a lovely wife or spouse and 2 children and all the rest of it. One of them's living in a fool's paradise because, in fact, his children hate him and his wife's unfaithful and his job is about to go bust and all the rest, and the other one isn't. Their neurophysiology may be exactly the same, but a whole tradition of moral philosophy since Aristotle would say that their well-being is not the same. One of them is actually living a good life, an enviable life, a life that we ought to encourage and is genuinely flourishing. The other one, being in a fool's paradise, is not. And books like Brave New World in 1984 explore exactly that fact about human flourishing.
That's all quite true. I did not mean to suggest that the brain is the only source of data to define human flourishing, and precisely for the reasons you allude to there, because the one person, the delusional person's state of happiness is vulnerable to all of the insults from reality that are soon to be coming. His relationships are not as he thinks they are. He has no money in the bank, etc. There are other aspects to human well-being apart from the state of a human brain, but the state of a human brain is where it is registered because our mind is emerging out of its activity.
Now, let me.
Actually, I think we should, continuing from the caller's question about altruism and its evolution, I think we can distinguish two different scientific projects with regard to morality because they are quite different. One is simply to understand how we got the way we are. We can look at what people do in the name of, quote, morality. We can look at the kinds of morally salient emotions like disgust or social emotions like empathy and behaviors like altruism. And we can look at all of this as it appears in diverse cultures and tell a story about how we got to this place. And it's an evolutionary story in general, and in particular, we can in each individual we can look at the states of the human brain and just how moral reasoning is arising in real time in the human brain. That is very different from a second project, which is the project I'm advocating, which is to the moment we admit that we should be concerned in the moral domain about human and animal well-being, then everything we can learn about how human beings flourish and what it takes to be happy in this world, then science can give us right answers to the question of how we should live. So, for instance, once we recognize that compassion is good for us, in that in a wide variety of circumstances it leads to human flourishing, how is it that we can encourage children to be compassionate? How is it that we can encourage them to be aware of the emotions of others, to care about the experience of others, to feel empathy? There are clearly going to be right and wrong ways to do that. And insofar as a maturing psychology, a developmental psychology can tell us how to teach compassion, this is something this will be a moment where science can really have strong recommendations about a very core area of values, how you should raise your child.
A large part of what we like from people are things like compassion and benevolence and charity as a virtue and so on. But these things are not the only virtues. Things like gratitude, loyalty, which are backward-looking.
These are
virtues.
states of the human brain, and
No,
they're stuff of which relationships are made.
They're states of the human being. I'm sorry.
Of course, but that's this is not actually a counterpoint to what I'm arguing for, because the Bill of Rights is so useful, and all of these social structures that allow strangers to trust one another and collaborate peacefully are so useful, and their utility can be described in terms of human well-being, in terms of the effect on human beings and their brains, and that's it's not a different basis for resolving questions of right and wrong. Yeah, I would take the word faith that was used earlier. I think Lawrence quite rightly purified it of its irrational components in the service of science. But faith, to hear most people talk about it, and certainly in a religious context, is the permission that people give one another to believe things for bad reasons. And when they have good reasons, they immediately rely on the good reasons. I mean, everyone craves good reasons for their core beliefs. And the moment prayer actually seems to work, the moment you actually run an experiment and pray for a sick child and the child gets better, all of a sudden that becomes the reason why you believe in God, not merely empty faith. And we all want our children to be healthy. And so, when your child has a seizure, in a context where there's no science of neurology, well, then you're worried about demons and demonic possession, and you go to the church and you try to figure out what to do. But the moment you have a science of neurology, then the diagnosis of demonic possession is no longer attractive, and this area of human flourishing, human health, gets taken away from the authority of the church and ceded to a genuine knowledge-gathering enterprise, which is medicine. And I think that's going to happen in the moral sphere as well. Honest talk about human well-being and a maturing science of the human mind will steal the ground from under religious claims to moral knowledge. Yeah, one thing I would add is I don't think we need to be too worried about defining well-being precisely or narrowly, because I think it is truly open-ended. I mean, there are frontiers of well-being that we may yet discover or fail to discover, both personally and collectively. We simply don't know how good human life could be. And the concern that gratifying every desire as it arises may not in fact be good is simply a concern about the deeper kinds of well-being that could be foreclosed if we live that way. And I think it's a totally legitimate question to ask. Certain short-term desires are clearly at odds with deeper long-term ones, and this is something we all understand, and it can be very difficult to be motivated by long-term desires where short-term preferences can be gratified. And this is a challenge for living a good life that we all face.
There's a challenge that we see this program and in the public faced by science, I think, and that is that scientific evidence in many cases cannot persuade people who've already made their minds up. If someone,
so you see that with evolution.
Well,
we can't. For 150 years, we've known it's true.
Well, you can see that with vaccination. You can see that with all global warming. You can see that with all kinds of things.
Well, I think
that's precisely why it's just a quick point. That's precisely why scientific truth is not predicated on democratic principles. I mean, we don't create our scientific worldview by plebiscite. The fact that only 25% of Americans believe in evolution doesn't for a moment stand as a challenge to biology. Biology thrives, and evolution is a fact. And who knows when everyone will agree. And I think that can be true in the moral sphere. There are truths to be known about human well-being, whether or not we can get the Taliban to agree and whether or not we, frankly, can get a majority of Americans to agree on all these points. That's a political problem more than a scientific one. Yeah, I would agree with all that. I would just add that the more we understand the causes of human behavior, I think that's going to push our moral intuitions around as well. Just simply understanding psychopathy, for instance, as a neurological condition, which it undoubtedly is, changes our notion, or it should change our notion of retributive justice. I mean, when you discover that someone has a brain tumor that explains their antisocial behavior, that changes your sense of their moral responsibility. And to some degree, we are going to find, as the science of mind matures, it's all basically a matter of brain tumors. I mean, we are not the author of our own causes. We don't create our genomes. We don't create our environments. And everyone on death row at this moment has either bad genes, bad parents, or bad ideas, and they're not really responsible in the usual sense for any of them. Now, this is not to say we don't have to lock away dangerous people. We do, but I think retribution as a motive, as opposed to just the preservation of human well-being, is going to be challenged by the